United States? No. I am going to answer the question in my thumbnail right off the bat. Technically, the First Lady of the United States is the spouse of the President of the United States. So by the books, no, Martha Washington is and always will be the First Lady of the United States. That being said, let's talk about Sarah Livingston Jay. And why would I even consider her as the First Lady of the United States? Well, we've talked about Sarah Livingston Jay not too long ago, but a brief rundown of her history. She was 18 years old when she married John Jay, about 11 years older than she was, in 1774, just as this man was attending the First Continental Congress, and yada, yada, yada. She was also a member of the widely large Livingston family, including her father, who was voted for independence, but left before signing the Declaration to be governor of New Jersey for the whole revolution. Her uncle, her father's brother, also voted for independence and hung around to sign it. Another of her father's cousin, Robert R. Livingston, also voted for independence, but again left before signing the Declaration of Independence. So she was from kind of an important family in both New York and New Jersey. She marries John Jay, himself a very important man, and just a few years later, they travel to Europe, where John Jay was minister to Spain. And while she's in Europe, Sarah Livingston Jay becomes adept at moving in social circles with literal royalty, first in Spain and then in Paris, where legend has it she even walks into a theater and is confused for Marie Antoinette because her beauty and the way she carried herself about the room. Now, when they returned to the United States, and I should note, actually, her younger brother, a year younger than her, traveled as John Jay's assistant this whole time, Henry Brockholst Livingston, who would, like John Jay, one day be an Associate Justice of the United States Supreme Court. But the importance of all this is that when they returned to the United States in the 1780s, from 1784 until 1789, when the Continental Congress is eliminated for United States and Congress assembled under the Constitution, John Jay is acting as Secretary of Foreign Affairs. And foreign affairs are so extremely important to the understanding of what it takes to be a leader that, I mean, you look, the first Secretary of State was Thomas Jefferson, fresh off the boat from France. The first Vice President was John Adams, fresh off the boat from Europe. And John Jay had been to Europe at this point on only one occasion, but for several years, establishing these connections. And having connections with the monarchs of Europe was extraordinarily important for any leader. Now, I never want to define a woman through her husband, and I'm just setting the stage for why Sarah Livingston was so important, because for the last several years, the Continental Congress held its meetings in New York City, which was Sarah Livingston Jay's hometown. And her husband had one of the most important roles in the Continental Congress because, the Continental Congress, because famously the Continental Congress could not get anything done. The Continental Congress, kind of lame, could not get a lot done, but the officers it hired it put a lot of trust in. So as Secretary of Foreign Affairs, the Minister of Foreign Affairs, as it was called at the time, John Jay was one of the most important people in the not yet federal government. He also, during this time, would, write the Federalist Papers, or some of the Federalist Papers. He would be important to the early creation of the United States government. And this is important because Sarah Livingston Jay, as his spouse, was in charge of overseeing the formal dinners of state. Now, I know it seems to kind of cast off women by saying, well, they were in charge of being hostesses and running dinners. Well, actually, these dinners were where things really happened. Famously, we look at the dinner that Thomas Jefferson had with James Madison and Alexander Hamilton that decided where the U.S. Capitol was, how the Treasury Department would be set up to this day. You'd have a nice meal, and then you'd get down to business afterwards. And Sarah Livingston Jay had the most important dinners. Her list that she kept of guests at her house was bragging rights, so to speak. We should note that the women, especially the women who went in elite circles during the American Revolution, were politically savvy. They understood politics. They may not have had the right to vote, which, not great, but they did have the right to understand politics and talk about politics, and they understood their role, a very important role, in not only helping the men make decisions, but as society's elite and controlling the society itself. Maybe not through government means, but through polite society means. And again, Sarah Livingston Jay was famous for her dinners. When I do my research for Founder of the Day, I can't tell you how many times I'll be researching. The more random a person, the less information there is out there about them. But almost every single one who served in the Continental Congress or in some fashion in the early government, they have at least somewhere their name falls on a list of guests to a Sarah Livingston Jay dinner. You were not important in the inaugural House of Representatives and United States Congress and the first first decade of the United States and the first 5 years before the Constitution was ratified. You were not important unless Sarah Livingston Jay had you as a guest at her house for dinner. Just to repeat, you were nobody unless Sarah Livingston Jay had you over. That's why, you see the name Washington appear on her dinner guest list pretty frequently. You see the names Jefferson and Hamilton. In fact, the Schuyler sisters, not just Elizabeth Hamilton, but Angelica Church, who we know as Angelica Schuyler from the play Hamilton. Angelica Church was she married John Barker Church, and when John Jay would later go to Europe to negotiate the Jay Treaty, he went without his spouse, but Sarah Livingston Jay's friend, Angelica Church, aka Angelica Schuyler, took care of John Jay and met his needs in social circles as a person who had never been to England. Now, I will say over the ensuing years, as we mentioned, John Jay actually leaves his position as Chief Justice of the United States to become Governor of New York, and Sarah Livingston Jay does actually become First Lady of New York, which I know from our modern eyes doesn't really matter much, but from their eyes back then, being First Lady of New York, one of the more powerful states, was extraordinarily important. And she maintained through this time, I will say, the United States government does leave and go to Philadelphia in the early 1790s, and she loses her power over the federal government, but maintains it in the state of New York, as New York is starting to hustle and bustle. Again, she's still First Lady of New York when Hamilton leaves Philadelphia to come back and start the stock exchange and start some banks. And she is really, like I said, not only in the early creation period of the federal government, but during the last 5 years under the Articles of Confederation, Sarah Livingston Jay is by far and away the most important hostess in the United States. And I'm going to repeat this one more time. During the American founding, during the late 1780s, you were not important if Sarah Jay didn't have you come to her house and put your name on her dinner list. I should give a shout out to a few other people, though. Lucy Knox, Henry Knox's wife, was also very important because Henry Knox was Secretary of War while Minister of War while John Jay was Minister of Foreign Affairs under the Articles of Confederation, and they both essentially transferred into those jobs in the Washington administration, bringing a lot of cohesion to the transition from one government to another. The ratification of the Constitution was essentially another revolution because they literally overthrew one government, the Articles of Confederation, with another government, the United States Constitution. Again, it was a very peaceful revolution, and they voted on it, but a revolution nonetheless. And Sarah Livingston Jay was at the heart of it. And now, sometimes we hear like, oh, there were presidents before George Washington. And no, it was a different role. For people like John Hanson and Elias Boudinot, who were simply chairmen of the Continental Congress as voted on by the other members of that same committee that was the Continental Congress. So Washington was the first president. And again, like I said, by the books, Sarah Livingston Jay was the first, Martha Washington was the first lady. But Sarah Livingston Jay's role in overseeing society in the late 1780s was more akin to what we understand the First Lady to be than the previous presidents were to what George Washington became. In fact, it almost could be argued that Sarah Livingston Jay had a little more power under the Articles of Confederation than Martha Washington might under the United States Constitution. Though, I've already made enough statements that I'll probably get ridiculed for in the comments, so we'll leave it at that today. Do me a favor, tell me what you think. Do you think Sarah Livingston Jay should be more respected as if not a first lady of the United States? Should she be one of the more well-known founding mothers, up there with the Martha Washingtons and Abigail Adams of the world? I would love to hear your opinion. Make sure you leave them in the comments down below. Hit like and subscribe on your way out. If you've never been here before, we put out American Revolution content 7 days a week, and I'll be back with another founder for you tomorrow.